Hi, Ross.
Hi, Bob. How are you?
I can't complain. How are you doing?
I could complain, but what would be the point?
So true. I certainly wouldn't be interested in your problems. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available on both streaming video and via audio podcast. You are Ross Douthat, famous New York Times columnist.
So famous.
So famous. What's it like? Can't go to the shopping mall? Oh, you can't go to those anyway these days. Never mind. But very well known, conservative thinker, author of a number of books, a book about Pope Francis, and the book we're going to discuss today, which is, I'm getting my copy out on my smartphone, The Decadent Society, How We Became the Victims of Our Own Success. Before we start, maybe we should say that we are recording this on June 3rd. I mean, we may have occasion to make reference to current events, conceivably, and at the rate at which things are moving these days, we should probably make it clear at the outset that that's when we're recording this. It probably won't go up for another week or so, I would guess. But
yes, I think I have found that many of my interviews about this book and otherwise have had parts of them overtaken by events in the last few months. So.
Well, the book itself got out not very far ahead of the pandemic, right? Not very far ahead of the lockdown?
Yeah, I had about 3 weeks two to 3 weeks of book tour, during which time I may have contracted the coronavirus myself.
Have you been tested?
I had a negative test, but my whole family got sick with something that, if it wasn't the coronavirus, was very like the coronavirus and unlike anything we'd had before. So we're going to get antibody tests at some point. But yeah, I snuck the book in just before, Decadence started to get a little bit unsettled, I guess you could say.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, the current, I guess what seems like ferment to some people, certainly change, might seem at odds with a simplistic rendition of your thesis. I mean, your thesis might be caricatured, and I know you would say this isn't what your thesis is, but it could be caricatured as saying not much of anything is happening. Now, I know that's not what you mean, but you do emphasize stagnation, and right now we don't seem to be in a period of stagnation. So why don't you start out by dispelling the misconception, which I'm sure you think it is, that that the current kind of rate of social and political activity is at odds with your thesis. And you might start earlier by telling people what you mean by decadence, because it's not exactly either the dictionary definition or the kind of vaguer connotative jumble that I carried around in my own head in association with the word.
Yeah, it's probably a slightly different connotative jumble, but basically I'm using it to mean stagnation, sclerosis, and repetition at a really high level of wealth and civilizational development. So the book basically argues that over the last 2 to 3 generations, starting sometime around the moon landing, which is where I begin the book conveniently, the developed world, Western Europe, the U.S., to some extent the Pacific Rim, entered into a period of economic deceleration, of sort of slowdown in technological change, where technological change that used to be sort of broad spectrum became concentrated more and more just in Silicon Valley. A period of sort of political stalemate and gridlock. That's probably the least controversial part of my thesis. A period of demographic decline, aging, people having fewer babies, society getting older, which feeds back into other forms of sort of stagnation, I would argue. And finally, this is the hardest to prove, but this kind of period of cultural recycling and repetition, where you have the same intellectual arguments, the same political coalitions, and the same superhero movies, and the Star Wars movies just remake themselves over and over again. So that's the big picture account, and it's compatible with really important events happening, in which obviously the pandemic is, and probably the protests that are going on as we speak are as well. And one of the, in a way, part of the impetus for the book was having lived through as an adult a series of dramatic moments, starting with 9/11, then the financial crisis, then even the election of Donald Trump. After all of those moments, there was this narrative that, the world will never be the same, everything has changed. And each time, I think, the sort of somewhat stagnant state of Western civilization reasserted itself. So it's not entirely, it's totally possible. And in fact, the book spends a certain amount of time entertaining these possibilities that something like a global pandemic could come along and genuinely put an end to decadence. It's possible that, my book can be like the Norman Angell book, where right before World War I, where he said there aren't going to be any wars anymore. And then there was.
I don't think he put his thesis quite that strongly, but no, certainly his timing was not optimal.
His timing was not optimal. And maybe I'm coming in, maybe I'm just looking backward and describing, maybe the book just describes a 40 to 50 year period that's now ending in chaos and revolution. But I'm skeptical. I think probably we will come through this particular moment and things will restabilize and decadence will reassert itself, but we'll find out.
Okay. So, one of the more controversial parts of your thesis has to do with technological change. You kind of, you associate yourself, I guess, with Tyler Cowen and others who have argued that really we're in a period of, in a sense, technological stagnation. And I gotta say, if you had told me there's a conservative who's gonna make a technology-related critique of modern society, who's going to express a certain amount of discontent. And we should say you are not happy with this state of affairs. And near the end of the book, you talk about several ways we might exit it if we do, although we might not. It may be a sustainable decadence. But anyway, if I had heard that there's a, kind of like a Burkean conservative, which I guess you'd call yourself, right? Who was unhappy with something related to technology. Well, I will let the record show that you're kind of, you didn't entirely affirm my characterization of you. What I mean is you're not like a libertarian conservative, a free market fundamentalist conservative who would tend to embrace technological change. You strike me as a kind of conservative who, if I heard that Ross Douthat had a technology-related critique of society, I would think things are moving too fast, right? I bring back
cats and dogs are living together. Yeah.
Bring back the good old days. Yeah. So, and we should say, you're a religious conservative and in that sense, a traditionalist. So that I assume you recognize this as in some sense, surprising part of your thesis.
I think that my perspective on some of these issues has changed a bit over the, I guess, 15 to 20 years now that I've been sort of a professional writer in public and had some kind of profile. And I've written a bunch of books that have all been sort of, in hindsight, they've all sort of been about decadence, right? I wrote a book about the Ivy League. I wrote a book about the Republican Party, a deeply decadent institution. I wrote a book about the American Christianity and my own Catholic Church. And I think over time, I've come to the conclusion that Western society, as it's constituted, doesn't really have a way back, a sort of plausible way back to some kind of organicist, rooted, traditional community, and that we have depleted, a lot of the material that sort of Burkean conservatives or even more traditionalist conservatives would look to as sort of the grounding for society. And so it's hard to imagine a kind of sort of pastoralist return for Western civilization. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, I also think that those forces that I think conservatives are interested in conserving or reviving, whether it's an institution like the family or an institution like the Roman Catholic Church, have in modern history tended to revive themselves in sort of creative tension with developments outside themselves. sort of new developments, new frontiers, new ideas. So, Catholicism enters into periods of torpor, and then in response to revolutionaries or secularists, it ends up reforming itself and, creating a new age of missionary zeal or a new age of saints and so on. And I think the same goes for whatever we think of as conservative politics writ large. So I am in a little bit of a different place from, like, my friend Patrick Deneen, for instance, who wrote a book called, How Liberalism Failed, that came out a couple of years ago. And there's a lot of overlap between our perspectives in the sense that we both sort of have a similar critique of how Western liberalism has kind of exhausted itself. But Patrick, and he said this in a review of my book, thinks that I'm too progressive in a sense. I'm too hopeful in sort of transformations in science and politics and so on, and maybe not conservative enough. And, that's possible. But I've come around, I think, to a... Meaning
not pessimistic enough, or meaning naively thinking that the source of hope could lie in technological change?
More the latter. More naively thinking that sort of novelty and the idea of progress are sort of necessary parts of any Western revival. I mean, I think, I'm enough of a conservative to think that certain kinds of progress are, if not an illusion, something of an illusion. There is sort of a bedrock of human nature that societies return to, and sort of, but I also think that, certainly, I think the society we've built depends on change and innovation and exploration. And if it's run out of ways to change and innovate and explore, I don't think we're going to get a sort of, return to traditionalism. I think we're going to get more of what we've had, this sort of stagnation. Like, to take an example that crops up in my book, as it does in a lot of arguments. Like, if you look at sort of rural America right now, you see, in certain ways, you don't see a ton of dynamism and innovation, right, in a lot of parts of rural America. But you also don't have, in those places, a sort of, sturdy bedrock of traditional values. You have some religious parts of America, but what you've gotten over the last 20 years as sort of economic progress in certain ways in the U.S. has slowed down is just a kind of stagnation and despair embodied by the opioid epidemic above all, which is sort of, that's I think my worry, that sort of instead of like, a virtuous Burkean community under stagnation, you get the opioid epidemic instead.
Yeah. And that, I mean, there are other dimensions of your worry that people will sink into virtual reality and increasingly escape from real reality. And in general, I think there's a whole chapter called Comfortably Numb, isn't there? Or is there not in the book? Yep. So, let me,
and that is just that part. I mean, I'm skeptical of some of the effects of technology, and there are whole chapters in the book.
I would argue that you're more skeptical than you realize, actually. I mean, in a sense. I mean, I guess I would say two things. I've always been a skeptic of the idea that technology isn't moving super fast. And when I first heard the thesis from Tyler Cowen, although I haven't really assessed his argument, I haven't read whatever version of he's put into writing, I got the sense, just listening to a little of what he said, that he was really undervaluing information technology and its transformative potential in general. He just thought of technology as like big machines, kind of, to oversimplify it a bit. And if I were like writing a review of your book and trying to sound as clever as I could, which is the whole point of writing reviews, I would accuse you of two things, like underestimating the significance of the current change in information technology. But more than that, I would argue that, the things you're most dissatisfied about, many things you're most dissatisfied about, and that you see as characterizing decadent society, are arguably products of information technology moving really fast. I mean, the obvious example is virtual reality. You're kind of like virtual sex replacing real sex and so on. That's one example of something you're not happy about that is a result of pretty recent technological change. So that would be my two-pronged my two-pronged critique. I want to say it's a great book. There's a ton of interesting ideas. And yeah, I mean, this could have been 3 books. There's so many interesting ideas. I mean, I would just advise you, as somebody older than you, Ross, pace yourself. You know, the time will come when you don't have any new ideas, when every book of yours will be, by your own definition, decadent, repetitive. You know,
but that's right. But those are the books that really sell, because that's, once people,
it can work that way.
People get familiar with you, and and are happy to know what's coming. But yes, I think that's sort of you could argue it's a tension in my argument. I think it's sort of in a sense, I'm arguing that the technological changes we've had are kind of the exception that has helped confirm the larger rule, right? So the argument is not that there has been no progress in information technology. Obviously, there's been rapid transformative progress, but that progress it's not just, as Cowan has argued, I think rightly, that it's been a more monodimensional kind of progress than you got like over the course of the Industrial Revolution. It's also that progress tends to make other forms of progress, not just technological, but political, aesthetic, intellectual, less likely by at least so far, by what the internet incentivizes, right? So, and again, this is where, the ongoing protests are raising questions about that argument. The book argues that online engagement with politics tends to be a poor substitute for real world engagement with politics. And so people treat politics as itself a kind of virtual reality that's all about, liking and dragging and clicking and so on, and aren't doing the hard work of sort of organizing and building the political infrastructure that changes political realities. Now, maybe that's happening right now, even as we speak. But I think there's been, since the rise of the internet, there's been a kind of symbiosis between how the internet encourages us to engage with politics and how little actually changes in our politics, which I do think very little has changed.
Well, yeah, I'd say not enough. I mean, I have my own view of the kind of radical political change that's needed, this was my argument in my book Nonzero, but it has to do with the evolution of robust international governance and so on. But I agree that politics is not making necessary adaptations. We're probably agreed on that, but in a way, what you're saying is the adaptations aren't even being forced upon us, right? I mean, I see really important technological change, but not only indicating the direction in which governance should go, but also making our own democracy obsolete. One reason it's so dysfunctional is because it was designed for different information technology, and we don't need to get into that, but am I right in thinking that you think both that politics doesn't seem to be headed anywhere interesting, and that, perhaps more alarmingly, change is not really being forced upon it in any coherent, identifiable way? Does that make sense?
Yes, I think that there is a lot of obsolescence in our government, in our political system, that is much harder to deal with than obsolescence in the past. That sort of the normal mechanisms of political change, both sort of the basic win an election and enact your agenda, and the more sweeping pass a constitutional amendment, have all sort of fallen into abeyance for a lot of different reasons. And at the same time, and I think many people would agree with that, especially maybe more on the left than on the right. But then at the same time, I'm skeptical that the forces that people think are going to force us to change will actually force us to change. I think there is more stability in our sort of position as an old, wealthy society. And in the case of the U.S., an old, wealthy society that still has, a sort of hemisphere unto itself, than people who expect like climate change to force transformation expect, right? So I'm skeptical that in 50 years we will say, well, we had a system that couldn't last in 2020, and then this cascade of external events came along, and sure enough, it didn't last. But that is definitely, and again, especially now with the pandemic and everything else, that's a more contrarian perspective, certainly, I think.
Okay. So let me let me say what I would say in elaboration about the technological dimension of your argument. We could spend a lot of time on that because it's a very interesting subject, but let me kind of get out the gist of what I would say and just let you respond to it. So there's a part of your book when you say, I guess the 30th anniversary, like some kind of update of, part of the thing is you are so in touch with culture and I'm not. So the cultural part of your argument, and it is an important argument to you that culture isn't moving anywhere interesting. I am totally at sea and ill-equipped to critique that. So I cede all that ground. I mean, all I feel, qualified to argue about is the political and social ramifications of technological change. But I am familiar with the movie Back to the Future. I can say that. And apparently there was some sequel to it that came out 30 years later. Is that the deal? And what you say is
the sequel was set. The sequel came out quite close to Back to the Future. It was set 30 years in the future. So Back to the Future goes back from 85 to the 50s, and the sequel goes forward from 85 to our own era.
So, but the question you raise, if I recall correctly, is like, when was there more change between 1955 and 1985, or between 1985 and 2015? Right? And the case I would make is that the answer is B. I mean, so for starters, I mean, well, we can actually put this in the context of movies. Have you ever seen a movie where you go, well, that plot line just wouldn't hold up because now we've got this technology and he would be able to tell her that. He would be able to notify her of that, or he would be able to get this information.
Yes, the horror movie in the age of the cell phone has a serious plot.
And not just the cell phone. What I would argue is that between 1955 and 1985, it's hard for me to think of such problems. Like every plot in 1955, so far as interpersonal technology goes, I think would kind of hold up. You got to get to a physical place to use a telephone. If you want some information, you have to get it out of a book. That's still pretty much true in 85. Whereas now, obviously, cell phone smart, you can know anything you want right away. There's no such thing as ignorance in a certain sense in the modern world. There's no such sense as, you know what I mean, though. There's no such sense as a well-known fact you can't get your hands on. Increasingly, there's no such thing as a person, an individual person you can't learn a lot about regardless of where you are in 2 minutes. Anyway, those kinds of, like nobody stops and asks me for directions anymore. That's a big change, you know? And that is something I miss, you might miss, because it was, in a weird way, it was a source of human community. Somebody stops, you give them directions, you feel good. Well, that too has been replaced by information technology. Anyway, you take my point, right? That if you pay attention to information technology, it's night and day. I think there's been, and I've only mentioned a few things. So.
Yes. But then outside information technology,
well,
right? So if you look at the Back to the Future stuff, that point that I make in the book comes at the start of the chapter that is on cultural and intellectual life and sort of everything from political debates to like fashion choices and stuff that I'm not really qualified to write about either. But you have to make some generalizations for the sake of a book. And I think the 55 to 85 versus 85 to the present period, the contrast is sharpest not in technology, but in fashion, culture, politics, sex, race relations, a whole host of things. So if you look at something like to take the issue that's in the news right now, the change in the position of African Americans in this country between 1955 and 1980, that shift compared to the shift between 1990 and 2015, there's no comparison. The shift in the first case is bigger. So that's and I think I make the argument that the same is sort of true of less social justice related areas. It's true in movies and other things, but we can leave that aside. On technology, I think I wouldn't pick 55 to 85 per se as the period to contrast, but let's take transportation, right? It takes the human race 69 years to go from Kitty Hawk to the moon. That's pretty amazing. And from and then we get the Concorde around the same time, and we sort of max out our we max out our global travel speeds. We get to the highest point in the solar, or the furthest point, I should say, in the solar system that human beings have reached. And then I think 1970 to 2020 is a letdown in that area. The built environment transforms much more dramatically between 1880 and 1960. The urban landscape of today is built in that period, and it's sort of finessed and refitted a bit today. The automobile revolution happens before that period, and so on. Antibiotics, right? But life expectancy changes, infant mortality, all of these things happen. So I think you're leaning hard on the area that I concede has changed, right? Information technology, and it's a big change.
It is a big change.
But compared to expectations, in the 1950s, people were like, well, we're going to have, we're obviously going to have nuclear reactors in our garage.
Yeah, but they didn't anticipate the things we do have. You see almost no one appreciating that before too long, you would have, wherever you were in the world, pretty much, you could get your hands on any fact instantaneously, for example. Not to mention the whole increasingly, in some minds, creepy, ability of, the kind of ambient AI, whether you want it or not, Google knows what you're doing. And this, by the way, is another thing.
Well, they thought we'd have robots, though. They thought we'd be able to, ask a robot. They didn't anticipate, I think, how small computers would get, but the computer on Star Trek it's bigger, but it's an ambient AI, and the communicator on Star Trek is sort of like the iPhone. Now, but admittedly, that is set 225 years.
There you go.
In the future, but it's set after the the genetic supermen come along in the 1990s. The Star Trek thought we would have a intra-species war effectively between human beings and genetic supermen in the 1990s. Where's my intra-human war, Bob? I was promised.
Give it time. I mean, Bill Gates said we tend to underestimate long-term change and overestimate near-term change. And I think, you can see the seeds of crazy stuff that's going to be hard to deal with, that's alarming and so on. And I would say, speaking of the kind of ambient AI, another thing you don't like is the kind of de facto surveillance, not surveillance state, but just the surveillance environment where some machine out there knows a lot about you, and also which, a panopticon that consists of other people knowing a lot about you and so on. And all that is information technology driven. I mean, I guess what I'd say broadly to your point is, of course, I'm emphasizing information. We're in the information age. I mean, there was an industrial revolution. Our processing of matter and energy was transformed. That slowly played out. If you want to think of society as a giant superorganism, that was like the muscles of the superorganism, or the everything below the head getting transformed. The information age is more like the stuff above the head, which many people would say is no less important, I guess.
Right, but shouldn't this... So let me say two things. First, I think it is totally possible that the point you made about seeds being planted right now is correct, right? And that, what I'm describing as decadence is a kind of lull or trough in which the developments that really are going to change society dramatically are being pioneered and will show up, and in 2045 or 2070 we'll say, well, things slowed down a bit technologically, between 1999 and 2017, but the CRISPR technology being pioneered at that point, it came of age 40 years later, and that was radically transformative. I think that's totally possible, and I'm not. The book spends, as you know, its latter portions are like spinning out various scenarios. It doesn't offer a single prophecy for the future. It sort of emphasizes this sort of sustainable decadence stuff because I thought that was my most contrarian take, right? Yeah. I think, and maybe my wrongest. We'll find out. But I guess on the question of what has changed to date, one, I do think there are ways in which if you think of this as like, well, we're transforming the brain, but then what if transforming the brain then makes the muscles atrophy, right? Like that's I think in part, like with the surveillance technology or something, right? Like, yes, that is a technological breakthrough. And but the question is, are we using that to further, breakthroughs or creativity in other areas, or are we using it to just sort of maintain a kind of social order that, again, maybe is falling apart even as we speak? But this is sort of, sort of brought to its sharpest point in anxieties about the kind of states that China is building, right? That sort of it is a authoritarian state that's using surveillance technology to become more effectively totalitarian than the totalitarianisms of the 20th century, to do things that the Stasi and the KGB could never manage. And, maybe that will lead to other forms of technological progress, or maybe it means that sort of something like the stagnation of the Soviet Union could have continued for another 50 years if they'd had better surveillance technology or something. That's one of the concerns, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, and if I seem to be dwelling unduly on the technology, I think that's partly because I'm more of a technological determinist than you are to begin with. I see that more as the kind of driving force in social and political change.
I mean, do you feel, like just from your own perspective, I know that we don't agree on this exactly, but has your view changed since Nonzero? When did Nonzero come out? That came out
20 years ago.
Right. So, I mean, at that point in time, I certainly was a conservative. I was probably in college or something, but I was certainly a conservative who was more worried about technology changing too quickly than too slowly. I was worried about our post-human future and, artificial wombs and basically all the things you would expect a social conservative to worry about. And I've ended up worrying about those less because I feel like the world, the sort of the horizons that seem to be open in the 1990s have sort of receded from us a bit. Mm-hmm. Do you feel that at all?
Well, the what I consider the most important part of my argument, I haven't abandoned, which is that technology is creating more and more non-zero-sum games among nations, often common threats, and if they don't get together and solve things like biological weapons, the threat of warfare in space, which could trigger a nuclear war, environmental problems, pandemics. I named all this stuff and argued that if we don't get more cooperative in a somewhat institutionalized way, which is to say some degree of global governance, we are in trouble. I think that's not that hard a thesis to defend right now. Personally, there are other parts of my book where that I have to qualify more. Not a ton. I probably sound a little too facile in my hopes that, at least now I do, in my hopes that information technology would force a government like China's to choose between granting economic and some degree of political liberty or just stagnating economically. That was kind of my feeling. And if that's going to be the case, it's going to take a longer time to play out. But my, I think, unfortunately, I would say if my thesis has been substantiated, has been in a negative way, we haven't really, we haven't made much progress on the global governance front. These threats, the only one that's reared its head lately is pandemic, but I think I could argue that these threats are closer than they were then. That's that.
Yeah.
What I'd add is that now I think more, and this maybe can take us toward kind of the end of your book, but I would say more than I did then, I would emphasize that I think it's going to take not just a revolution in governance, but a revolution in moral outlook, and you could even say a spiritual revolution in the sense that clearly a big impediment to getting where I'd like us to go is kind of what you could call the psychology of tribalism. Manifests in American political polarization, in growing tensions with China, whatever. I would say that, in both cases, we're not really seeing, people naturally don't see things clearly. They do get tribalistic. And I think if we don't get better at, more aware of the cognitive biases that drive that, we'll be in trouble. Now you bring religion and spirituality in and close by asking the question of what role religion will play or can play. If there is Renaissance, you lay out these various scenarios. There can be continued manageable decadence. There can be catastrophe, climate change, or various others. There can be Renaissance. And I guess, I I would ask you, don't you kind of in your heart, I mean, you're presenting the argument not to fellow Christians. You mean the argument to hold up to just sheer intellectual scrutiny. You're not appealing to anyone's faith. So I had the suspicion that in your own mind, Renaissance, and there are hints of this in the book, but that in your own mind that Renaissance is going to have to involve a religious dimension, maybe more than you're entirely explicit about. Does that make sense?
I mean, that's probably true. I've written other books about religion that are sort of more explicit, probably, on that point. And it's not the book does argue that any Renaissance would have to have a strong religious dimension.
Okay. That is your view.
I think I think what I say at some point is that just as decadence is entangled, right? It's part of my argument is it's this intensely entangled phenomenon where you have feedback loops between economic deceleration, the technological stuff we've been talking about, and political sclerosis, people not having kids, and that they, it's a tangle. So you can't just say, the problem is, neoliberalism, that, neoliberalism destroyed the economy or something. You can't just say, it's polarization, right? I mean, I've had arguments with Ezra Klein, who has a book about polarization, right? About, how much of our political problems can be reduced to just that. So it's hard. I think it's a sort of somewhat irreducible problem where everything is happening together. And then Renaissance is a somewhat mysterious phenomenon that when it happens is similarly entangled, right? So you could get, to speculate, you could get a technological change that in turn inspires a lot of religious change, right? This happened basically with the printing press, from a Catholic perspective, for better or worse, right? But similarly, right? Like, if you went a little further into virtual reality, which is obviously something I'm somewhat worried about, maybe that provokes a kind of moral awakening or transformation where, the great religions start to think about, what does ethics mean? How are human beings supposed to relate to this new technology so that it doesn't just sort of capture and dehumanize them? And so maybe you have technology driving religious change, or maybe it's through a debate about biotechnology or something else, or maybe it's that a technological change changes the social landscape in ways that sort of change how people relate to each other, and religious bodies interact with that. So I think it's an interactive phenomenon where it's not just as simple as you need a new prophet, or a new, from a Catholic perspective, a new Saint Francis or Saint Dominic. But no, I mean I'm a religious person, and I think that that a big part of the exhaustion I'm describing is a sense of futility, I think, that people feel about having a coherent picture of what human beings are and how they relate to the universe, right? I feel like Western civilization sort of tried to go beyond Christianity in various ways, sort of Marxist, fascist in certain ways. I mean, maybe that's going backwards.
You mean beyond it in the sense, in the sense of having different underlying views of human nature, or different in the sense of conceptions of teleology, or what?
All of that, in the sense of looking for a comprehensive world picture that wasn't Christianity. I think certainly that's what Marxism was for the people sort of most under its sway. It was a theory of history and morality and teleology. And people weren't happy with where those attempts ended up. And so there was this brief Christian revival, I think, in the West that I talked about in my book about Christianity, Bad Religion. And then that sort of fell apart in the 60s and 70s. And since then, we've had this sort of mixture of, sort of a certain amount of scientific materialism in certain parts of the intelligentsia, joined to a certain kind of liberal idealism that doesn't really know what its idealism is quite grounded in. A certain amount of New Age spirituality that's very interested in experience, but hasn't really translated that into a sort of a theology or metaphysics of what that experience means. And so I think all of that is part of what I'm describing as decadence. And I think a society in that position is probably looking for either a new synthesis or a new set of competing syntheses that make people feel like they know what the meaning of life is. And so I'm interested in things that that seem to offer that, not just in my own, out of my own faith, but also, I write a bit in the book about sort of pantheism and paganism and whether those sort of stirrings could develop into something. I'm interested. I was interested in your book about Buddhism, but I don't think anybody is there yet. I'm interested in Islam, right? Like the sort of...
you are commendably eclectic in the book. I mean, when you run through these Renaissance scenarios, you discuss various religions that, in some cases, however improbable it may seem, could wind up being part of a Renaissance even in the West, and you spend a lot of time on the possibility that Africa could make a big cultural contribution to a Renaissance, all of which makes it an interesting book.
I think Africa and China are in different ways the really interesting religious ground of the 21st century, because Africa is one where the people are, where the young people are, which makes a big difference. And it's a place of sort of intense Christian growth that isn't happening anywhere else. And also a sort of growing and potent Islam that's in conflict with Christianity. And then China is a little bit, it's a little bit like ancient Rome. You don't want to push these comparisons too far, but it's sort of an empire whose prevailing ethos, the ruling class doesn't completely believe in anymore, and it's sort of, going through the motions of Marxist-Leninism the way the, Roman emperors went through the motions of the auguries or something. And then you have underneath a lot of growth of Christianity, other faiths too, sort of stirring or reviving. And, it's just interesting. Like what will be the worldview of the Chinese elite in 75 years is to me a really interesting question, I think.
Well, you also think there's a comparison to be made between us and Rome, right? I mean,
sure. Everybody reached the Roman comparison it's a crutch, but it's a crutch for a reason. It fits very neatly under everybody's shoulder.
Sure, but I mean, you're not just suggesting that there is a comparable prospect of decline. You also you refer to this view that Rome had to be saved by something fundamentally new, in this case, Christianity, right? And that it'll take something comparably novel, if not necessarily the same thing in this case.
Yes. I mean, I think, so there's a sort of narrower, or there's a more and less over-the-top version of that, right? So the less over-the-top version is just, I think, the observation that Rome had its own decadence that persisted for a long time. I think it's reasonable to think of the zone from, the first and second century Rome through the fall of the Roman Empire in the West as a period of decadence punctuated by attempts at revival and revitalization. And one of the revitalizing forces, notwithstanding Edmund Gibbon's claim that it was, it was the Christians' fault that Rome fell, was Christianity. And that Christianity didn't save the Roman Empire as the institution that Augustus Caesar built, but it saved Roman forms in different ways in the West and in Byzantium, in ways that lasted for hundreds or thousands of years and are still with us today to some extent. And so you can see ways in which that could happen with not necessarily Christianity, some other new emergent faith in the U.S. context. But then the more over-the-top version, I guess, is the point that, what people in Rome felt like they had, which was a world-spanning empire, we actually have, right? We really have filled the earth and subdued it. And hanging over us, therefore, is this question, part of which you were getting at talking about Nonzero, right? Of like, can we figure out how to work together before our technologies or, some natural disaster destroys us, right? That's sort of one question. But then the other question is, and I think it's ultimately, they're related questions, but I think it's the more important question is there anywhere else to go? Because I feel like if we're stuck here long term, then human nature being what it is, I'm sort of betting against the optimistic thesis. I'm betting that things, that we're sort of, you hang on for a while and then things fall apart. And so from a religious perspective, there's a big universe out there. We're not sure what it's there for. Is it decoration? Are we supposed to explore it? I don't know. But that's like a question that really confronts us now in a way it hasn't ever confronted us before.
Yeah, you talk about space travel quite a bit near the end, I guess. And you also bring up this idea of it's sometimes described as the great filter. There are other people have noted. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the basic idea is like, why haven't we heard from more aliens?
Right.
If we assume that if we assume that evolution, we know that there are more and more inhabitable planets. We discover that all the time. Apparently there's a ton of them in the universe. I think there's good reason to believe that if evolution got started on a congenial planet, it would stand a decent chance of producing an intelligent species. And we've seen that once technological evolution gets going, at one rate or another, you would agree, tends to move forward. And so the question is, well, why haven't we heard from more of these people? And you go through and of course the answer may be a premonition of our future. We may, and my own preferred version of the answer, of course, is, well, they get to this point, they're on the verge of a global community, but that takes a revolution in governance and morality, arguably spirituality, and it's just too challenging. And they blow the place up or something, or they keep setting themselves back epically.
But that's a pretty dark view for your thesis, in the sense that it implies that, it's like that. Yeah. See, I'm gonna act decadent. I'm gonna cite the Avengers, right? Where in the Avengers, the Doctor Strange, who sees the future, at some point, they're fighting this supervillain, and he says, "I've seen 1,232,000 possible futures, and there's only one in which we win." Right.
Right.
And that's that's the scary prospect for both of us, but certainly for the thesis, the arguments of your work, right, is that the odds against that revolution in governance and consciousness are like 1 million, given the scale of the universe, maybe they're 1 billion, 1 trillion to 1, which is,
It depends on what assumptions you make, but yeah, no, there's a dark version of it, and, but here's a related question. First of all, you don't mention, on the one hand, your book, notwithstanding the arguments about technology not moving as fast as some people think, it is in some ways futuristic, as I suggested. Its backdrop is in a certain, among many backdrops, perhaps, your Christianity. You don't mention one of the most futuristic Catholic theologians I'm aware of, Teilhard de Chardin, who figures right into this. He thought, he was more confident than we sounded in the last 5 minutes. He thought humankind was being drawn together by information technology. He's talking about this like 100 years ago, pretty much. And it's a very prescient view in that sense. He sees like a global nervous system, and he imagines it drawing people together in love. And he considered that a very Christian view. You don't, you're not a Teilhard guy, I take it.
I enjoy a lot of that sort of just pre-Vatican II sort of.
This has a dismissive sound, Ross. Go ahead.
It's not dismissive. I find Chardin very. There's some issues of heresy that we don't need to get into, but but two, there's sort of a vagueness, right, that I think comes into a lot of these sort of revolution and consciousness ideas that. So, and I guess this is sort of where there is sort of I have some theological presuppositions that are sort of, I think there's a little more Buddhism, maybe
in Teilhard.
In Teilhard than there is in me. And I tend to assume that there is, on this side of eternity, there are sort of some of what you're describing as tribalism in human nature is just ineradicable without also eradicating things that are good about human nature. That there's sort of some package deals built in, and that a lot of the sort of global supermind stuff assumes a loss of human personality along the way that's a little bit too much like the It in Madeleine L'Engle's Wrinkle in Time or something. That's sort of an extreme example. And so I'm more drawn, I think, to images of the future. I think this is probably the appeal of certain kinds of mid-century science fiction where, you have new frontiers and new places to go, and it's the same, but it's still human beings doing it. It's not a sort of transformed species, because I worry about what's lost in the transformation, I guess. And that's probably where I resist Chardin, and where I resist maybe my misunderstanding of some Buddhist ideas and theology. The sort of disappearance of self and personality seems to me something that I'm not all in for.
Yeah.
I guess.
That's more theoretical than a practical concern, I'd say, given the fact that I still haven't met anybody who I thought had actually attained enlightenment.
Yes, but if Chardin is right, I mean, there is some, the vision does have some elements of that.
It does. I mean, he certainly, on the other hand, certainly, I think, first of all, he addresses, I think, the concern that, the identity of the cell is lost in the organism. And then there's the fact that he has, as they say, a Christology, I guess. It's certainly, in the end, he's seeing it as compatible with, Christianity. I mean, there's one other Christianity question, which is, maybe I have a naive view of, Christian belief, but the way you're exploring these possible future spaces, seems to me like the kind of thing that could only be done, or would be more likely to be done earnestly by somebody who's not a Christian, because as I understand Christianity, there's not as much doubt as, as you seem to have about where things are headed. Now, maybe that's a pretty, like I was brought up Southern Baptist, that may be a pretty old fashioned, Christianity I'm referring to, but you take my point, right? I mean, there's supposed to be a second, isn't there supposed to be a second coming? Let me just put it that simply.
There is definitely supposed to be a second coming, yes.
Thank you.
And some of the analysis I'm doing is probably trying to stand outside a little bit my own theological assumptions. Like the reality is, like to take the pessimistic considerations we were just discussing, right? Like as a Christian, I think we beat the odds, right? I don't think we just get annihilated and the universe goes on and nothing comes of it. I think the human drama is, if not the central drama, one of the central dramas of the universe. Maybe there are other species for whom Christ needed to come and die on other planets, but certainly we're as close to the center as anybody. And that means that, I don't think there's just a great filter that will swallow us up. I'm entertaining that idea as a possibility that a reasonable non-Christian could entertain. Mm-hmm. But my fundamental belief is either the second coming happens in some, as some endpoint of some kind of decadence or turmoil on our planet, or it's in some distant future and we have a larger destiny in the stars. Those are my two possibilities as speaking as a believer.
But in your heart, you have more optimism than might be evident in the book. Not that that's disingenuous. It's just because you felt the book should be an argument and not an expression of faith.
Well, and there's also, you can say I have a fundamental optimism about human destiny. Mm-hmm. But that if you told me, well, Western civilization will be sunk in decadence for 400 years and Christianity will, become a sort of minority persecuted sect for much of that time, and then everything will, and then the West will collapse and the Christianity of the future will emerge from other places and the church in North America will be forgotten, that's a possibility. Christ said the gates of hell are not supposed to prevail against the church, but they could prevail against the church in southern Connecticut. That's allowed within Christian cosmology.
Okay. So, just final sci-fi question, and then I have a kind of a closing question. The thing about virtual reality and people sinking into a virtual reality, not just by virtue of information technology, but presumably with the aid of pharmaceuticals and so on, just the ability to construct a fantasy reality. I've always thought that the more plausible version of the movie The Matrix isn't the one we saw, but a version in which people slowly, incrementally choose, not one where robots stuff them into these pods, but where people choose incrementally to move toward the pod life and finally just, is that, you don't put it like that in the book, but is that your concern?
Yeah, I think that's more, I think that's more plausible. And yeah, that's my concern. I mean, the concern is sort of somewhere in between the obese people with screens in space future in Wall-E and Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a future where maybe there's some sort of state playing some role in steering people in this direction, and this is, where the sort of surveillance panopticon stuff comes in. But fundamentally, it's that a culture that's sort of exhausted and hedonistic at the same time and could sort of choose to move ever further in that direction. I mean, I have enough confidence both in the resilience of the good things in human nature and, as I was just saying, in, the goodness of Almighty God, that I'm doubtful that you get stuck in the full dystopia forever. But I think there are elements of our society that, even from the vantage point of 20 years ago, would clearly have a sort of dystopian element.
Okay.
That, opioids and porn together, if you had told someone 25 years ago where sort of pharmaceuticals and pornography would sort of take society, I think it would have sounded a bit dystopian.
Yeah. So then this final question, we alluded to current events early on, and maybe if you feel like it, I think I can imagine how you might answer the question, wait a second, if we are in a period of stagnation, how come I'm glued to CNN waiting to see what's going to happen tomorrow, at least, at this point, June 3rd, both, in terms of the pandemic and in terms of the protests and civil unrest. I think part of your answer would just be the clarification. I'm not saying a lot of stuff doesn't happen. I'm talking about kind of directional change as opposed to like cycles of repetition and so on. But how would you flesh that? Do you have a way of fleshing that out in terms of, say, well,
it's easier. I think it's easier with the pandemic than with the protests, right? I mean, the pandemic is an external, it's not external to planet Earth, but it's sort of an unexpected, predictable but unexpected external shock to the system. And it's sort of a stress test where we try and figure out, how decadent are we? Are we sufficiently decadent that when a shock like this comes along, we just sort of collapse? Or are we less decadent than we thought and we can sort of beat this thing quickly? Or, which is where I think we're ending up, are we sort of somewhere in between where we're not so vulnerable that we're going to get the sort of million dead, Stephen King's The Stand sort of social collapse scenario, but we are decadent enough that, we have lots of failure at every level of government that's going to lead us to a place where we just sort of say, well, we can't really beat the virus. We can sort of contain it, and we're just accepting that 100,000 people have died. Another 100,000 people are going to die before we get out of this. And then once we get out of this, maybe things actually go back more to normal than people think right now. In the same way that 9/11, the financial crisis, and even the election of Trump were less world historical than people thought. So that's the argument with the pandemic. And, it remains to be seen. It could be that the pandemic could inspire sort of new technological change. And, Mark Andreessen, the Silicon Valley tycoon, wrote a big essay a few weeks into the crisis saying it's a time to build, and we haven't been building enough in America. Our institutions have failed. We need to rebuild them. Maybe that happens. Maybe there is some sort of revitalization out of this shock. But I think it's pretty easy to see how a pandemic could sort of demonstrate the decadence of our institutions, offer the promise of change, and then have it sort of evaporate. The protests, because they are sort of dramatic political engagement, are less decadent. And I have a portion in the book where I sort of say how striking it is that even in the age of Trump, there haven't been that many protests. There hasn't been the kind of urban unrest that a lot of people expected. And that, to me, sort of confirmed this sense of people just engaging with politics through their screens. But that's not what's happening as we speak in many, many American cities. And so then the question becomes, well, what comes of this? Is it possible to have these kind of protests, have these kind of riots lead to dramatic change one way or another. And that's, again, where I would say maybe the decadence of the system reasserts itself. But mass protests are themselves, they're not decadent, and they do contradict one of the pieces of analysis I have in the book. Not that should prevent anybody from, buying and reading it, but they're harder to fit into the framework than the pandemic writ large, I think.
Although even there, if there were this kind of expression, this kind of adamant political expression, but it turned out that the ideologies being expressed, to the extent that they were being articulated at all, weren't really new. And so that would apply to people who are, for example, socialists. I assume you would say, well, okay, but it's the same old, it's just recycling.
Yeah, I mean, I think there could be, I think we could look at this in 5 years and say it was this weird sort of reenactment of the late 60s. We had the Elon Musk SpaceX, rocket takeoff, which was sort of like an homage to Apollo, and then we had these riots that or these protests and riots that had a sort of some similarities to the 60s in that the racial issues of racial justice engaged, but their effects were less sweeping, their goals were less sweeping, and just as the Musk launch took us back into space but not to the moon, these protests and riots sort of summoned up a little of the spirit of the 60s, but then things settled down again. But I'm hesitant. Obviously, part of me believes that argument, or I wouldn't have, written this book. But I'm hesitant to make it too forcefully, given, I certainly didn't see these protests coming.
Okay. Well, like I said, it's a great book. There's a ton of. I have to say, I truly am in awe of the different realms in which you are conversant in thinking, and the number of actually original ideas.
Well, the second part I appreciate. The first part, there's a little bit of columnist flam.
You're faking it. Oh, well, you shouldn't have told me that.
I'm not faking it, but the vocation of the newspaper columnist is to present oneself as having intense familiarity with every great subject that comes along.
You do a pretty convincing job, more convincing than some, I might add, and I won't mention names. But I will say, I think you truly have one of the very most cerebral regular newspaper columns in America, including even the New York Times, where yours appears. Now, the one thing we didn't talk about is your chapter on sterility. You're concerned about the birth rate, but you're certainly doing your part. You've already got 4 kids, and I know, and apparently you now have to turn to them. So I guess I'll let you go.
Yes,
congratulations!
We have a newborn downstairs that I should.
Congratulations on that. On being a good Catholic, and
not sure about that, but she
well, at least in this one respect.
Yet, so in this one respect, that's right. It's I'll sneak into purgatory. Well, yes, but thank you, Bob. It was great. It's been too long.
It has been.
We should do this again. I'll write another book.
Hey, I'm available. I'm not writing a regular column. So thanks. Good luck with the book, The Decadent Society. Everybody should read it. And I hope we will talk soon. Thanks, Ross.
Thanks.